Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm José.
And we're talking about Roma.
Which we've just seen on Netflix.
On a telly.
On a telly. And Mike has been moaning.
Instead of a cinema screen, where films are supposed to be. It's a film that's going down very well. You know, it's making kind of top 10 lists and best of the year and all that sort of stuff. People are really into it. It's written and directed and shot by Alfonso Cuarón. Mm-hmm. And it's autobiographical to a reasonable extent, and it's about where he grew up in Mexico in a neighborhood called Roma,
right?
Which is it's a middle class / upper middle class neighborhood. It's about a family. The kind of, I think the young boy that you see most of in the family is the cipher for Alfonso Cuarón himself, but it's about the entire family and particularly the maid. Who's a live-in maid called Cleo, who is kind of indigenous, right? She speaks a language. She is
indigenous.
She speaks a language Mixcal.
I don't know. She speaks a language.
She speaks a language. I think it's Mixcal, which I'd never heard of. But the film the film is in Spanish primarily, and the subtitles come up at the start to say subtitles for Spanish will be like this, and subtitles for Mixcal will look slightly different, so you know what they're speaking. I'd never heard of this language, so clearly there's there's a project of kind of representation there. That the only time you hear Mixcal is when she's speaking with other quote unquote indigenous.
Usually people. Other domestic servants.
Exactly. The family and people of higher status don't speak it, and there's also an element of you get the sense of the language kind of fading out. That I think she's told at one point, "Don't speak it."
The little boy tells her,
"Yeah,
don't speak that." Yeah. I can't understand.
So,
the way English people tell other people speaking other languages in trains now to stop speaking.
Well,
speak English.
To be honest, I think it more goes with when we tell the Welsh not to speak Welsh.
Well, there's that joke.
That's more about kind of being indigenous. But yeah, exactly. There's certainly an element of kind of cultural whitewashing.
Yes, there's a hierarchy in the film as well. Yeah.
The film is about 2 hours 15 minutes long, and it has a tonal sort of set of movements in it. It does have plot, but there's an awful lot of just watching the way that life goes.
Yes.
And kind of living in the world.
I love that.
Yeah, go on then.
But no, I love that. I mean, I think people have been talking about the debt to neorealism, and one of the ways in which this film is indebted to neorealism is that you see a whole world around the protagonist's dilemma, right? So the protagonist normally, you're introduced to her. In this case, the maid. She kind of lives in a particular room with another maid. I think she's the nanny and maybe the other one's the maid, but they share domestic tasks. They're subordinate to the family. They live in this little room, kind of semi-outside the house. But actually what Cuarón always is showing you is a whole world that goes along with who they are and what they do. So, when you go to the cinema, you're seeing the film, you're seeing the architecture of the cinema itself, you're seeing the people hawking, whatever it is they're hawking outside, right? When the mother takes the children to the beach to tell her about her divorce, you see a wedding taking place. Right, there's always things happening on the streets, student protests, as her water breaks, right? So you get the sense of a whole world that's being kind of revealed as, context. Yeah, there's a context to these people that's kind of revealed in widescreen and in depth of field by tons of other events happening alongside.
Yeah, it's a film in which sort of the visual design is very crisp, very clear and very neat and very, very careful, and you could sort of freeze frame aspects. You could just take shots and pause it and look at all the details and all the set design and all the people. If it's in like a street scene, all the people kind of dotted around and how they're dressed and what they're doing and how they're interacting, all that sort of stuff. There's an awful lot of detail and all of that. It's incredibly carefully composed, and also in these shots you get these like 360 degree pans You know, they're not always 360 degree, but sometimes they are. The very, very slow pans across scenes or like inside the house, things like that, where the action is kind of it's very carefully choreographed and timed.
Yes.
And there's it's kind of theatrical. You know, it's or in other words, it's not naturalistic. It's not kind of you feel the sort of technique in it.
Yeah, you feel a kind of mise en scène. There's a scene,
Right.
for example, where what's the protagonist's name?
Cleo.
Where Cleo is walking through the house, you know, and you see children jumping on a bed, and then you see the husband and a wife having an argument in another open bedroom, and kind of each of the bedrooms frames an action as she walks by. It's very carefully,
Exactly.
put on the scene.
The language is called Mixtec.
Uh-huh.
Mixtec. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. Mixtec, but that's so
Mixtec.
I'd not heard of it. But there you go.
Yes.
Anyway, back to what we were talking about. So we're talking about the mise en scène.
Yes, which I think is very beautiful. I mean, I was very interested in just my own response to the film, right? Because part of the reason why I hesitated so long to see it was because of the length, right? And because it was in black and white, right?
They were turn-offs for you.
They in modern film they are like, I mean, I love black and white film.
So you're always telling me how much I hate black and white film.
Well, there you go.
I know
Anyway,
it's true,
I think there's something pretentious about kind of making a film today in black and white normally. Though, of course, I loved Cold War and found it incredibly beautiful. But anyway, it's a prejudice, but it's mine. So, I put off seeing it. And then, like, as often happens, then you feel foolish for having done so because, to me, it just whizzed by. I found it, like, constantly engrossing. I would be lying to say that I found it moving. And actually, maybe that's something we can talk about. I mean, there were obviously moments where I felt I should be moved, but I wasn't quite. Right?
I know what you mean.
So
well, let's say as well. We will get into spoiler territory.
Yes.
What spoiler territory there is. I would imagine you're speaking about when Cleo gives birth
That's
to
right.
a stillborn baby.
That's right. And actually, the scenes around that are very interesting because, so first of all, it's very dramatic, right? So, she's shopping for a crib, and there are student protests happening outside, and that is beautifully shot. You could see, thousands of people running on the streets, even as you were also seeing the shop. It's really beautifully done. But then kind of there's gunfire and there's gunshots, and some people chase the student protester and they shoot him on the spot, and you realize that one of the people who's shooting him has been the boyfriend who doesn't want to recognize the child as his.
Yeah.
Which actually I would have liked to have seen more of. But sorry, I'm losing track. I mean, the reason why I didn't find the hospital scene moving is because you think something is being done. So, you arrive at the hospital, and it's taking them a long time to arrive at the hospital. They arrive late. And then, there are all these dozens of women in labor pains outside the hospital, right? And you wonder kind of what's that about. And, and then you arrive at the hospital, and she gets preferential treatment because obviously she's coming in, with the grandmother, right? With the white, middle-class grandmother. And then when as you go through the various things of the hospital, there are all these women in labor, in pain, screaming. But it feels like two people, too much. Like there's some point being made through just, this background of like so much labor, so much pain. Yeah, that kind of is now centralized. It seemed that there was going to be some other payoff to that I wasn't getting, right? So the death of the child, which I knew I was supposed to be like extremely moved by, I just kind of wasn't.
Yeah. If there were things about that felt blank to me, kind of plain, and there seemed to be more that was signifying things you should feel rather than actually being emotionally expressed, right? Real emotional. I didn't feel a kind of emotional heart in the thing. I felt everything was a representation of something.
Yes. I did feel moved. There were moments that did move me. So, for example, the moment where she goes to the martial arts training
Yes.
to find her husband, it really reminded me of an Emilio Fernandez film actually called Victims of Sin, where this prostitute goes chasing after her pimp, who's fathered the child, and with the baby in her hands is like, please take me back. It had kind of moments of that, actually. Though, of course, Cleo is so much more austere and quiet and, maintaining a kind of dignity that, the women in Victims of Sin, didn't have. But I thought that was a powerful moment, really. Yeah. It moved me. Because you also kind of see patriarchy at work, right? And I think there's also a kind of a commentary that I'm not sure I understand on Mexican society, on the casual violence, on the guns, on the ease with which people are killed. Yeah, on the ease with which, this pregnant woman is threatened to be beaten up by, the father of her child. I think the film is really textured. It's actually, I think it's something that in a way I'd like to see again and think about some more. And some things are coming out just in talking about them now, really. But I like that very much. And to me, kind of, the film is leisurely paced, but I was surprised by how suddenly it ended. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yes, I kind of,
That's exactly the kind of feeling I expected from the ending. I didn't expect like a big moment or anything.
No, but I was just surprised because I mentally, I just thought we have another 45 minutes to go or something.
I see what you mean.
Kind of, it's a compliment to the film.
Right.
That, it seemed to end so quickly.
Oh, right, that's interesting. It didn't feel like it hugely took its time for me. Like, I didn't feel like, when's it going to end? It felt like it ended at an appropriate moment for me. That's interesting. But there's certainly the kind of, what actually happens at the end, the kind of returning to her work and the shot just looking up into the sky, I thought, that's how I would have done it. Like, that's not a compliment.
No.
No, something more interesting. There does, I feel a sense of banality around the whole thing. Like, I didn't feel like there were things I hadn't seen before in a way. Which if they're done well is not necessarily, it's not necessarily a criticism, but I felt like I've seen this film before.
I haven't. What do you have in mind?
I don't know. Well, I certainly have seen when people. I think I have a real dislike of quote unquote personal films. When people talk about filmmakers making personal films, particularly ones really what that's code for, I think, is films in which a filmmaker will very transparently make a film about their childhood and very often include themselves as a cipher character in some way in it. Something like The 400 Blows, which I find interminable.
I love it.
Oh, I can't stand it. Or The Tree of Life. I don't think I've ever seen one of these films that I really liked. And I think there's a way in which doing a project like this sort of feels important just because of what it is. This is the film where I'm talking about myself and it's therefore important somehow. The problem is that just after we watched the film and before we started recording the podcast, we had a look at a number of essays that were collected.
So Mediatico almost immediately published a whole series of essays by some of the most distinguished writers on Latin American cinema of the moment. So Paul Julian Smith and Deborah Shaw and Dolores Tierney, and a whole Belén Vidal, a whole bunch of excellent film academics.
And we'll link to the dossier in the description as well.
Yes.
And it's really worth reading. And one of the things that came up in this dossier is one of the threads between most of the essays is we're responding to Richard Brody in The New Yorker. A lot of them mention it. And I'd been resisting reading his review just because I didn't want to kind of take things that he'd said and use them on, I didn't want to do that. And I'd also heard that he was one of the few people who had not an entirely positive view on the film. It's, like I say, it's been going down really well. But because we were having a look at this dossier, and he was coming up to me, I was like, I've got to read this thing. And then I find out that what he was saying is essentially a lot of what I said. He said it much better, and kind of had more interesting things to say.
Well, take us through these points. I mean, where does your thinking and Richard Brody's coincide?
So when I talk about the kind of person, I think he mentions something along the lines of not quite assumed knowledge, but a kind of assumed importance, like the fact that this is all true to some degree, or based on true experience, gives it import that in another situation you wouldn't get away with not explaining. You wouldn't get away with not dramatising, really.
Okay, so what do you have in mind?
The way in which life is kind of depicted, the quotidian, day-to-day life of the maid and of the family and everything else going on in this area of Mexico, is not that interesting. Or it wasn't dramatised such that I understood why it was interesting.
Well, it might not be interesting to you, but it certainly proved... I mean, one of the things that the dossier brings out is how interesting everybody else found it.
Exactly.
Because, it's really resonating with people of a particular class and a particular age. This is their world and this is their childhood, so it's of great resonance to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
For me, it sparks a desire to know. So, I mean, I don't know what those students' protests were about. I imagine that they have historical significance. I don't know what they were about or what the repercussions were or whatever, but, I think they work very well in the film, and they dramatize certain things very well, and they dramatize the discontent and changing times and, attitudes to authority that I don't think you have to be an expert on Mexican culture to know. And it makes you want to know more about, what was that event about. So, I mean, I do want to take on other issues, because the thing is that Richard Brody has been used as a kind of a bogeyman.
Okay.
So basically, my very quick skimming through that article, there were 2 points that seemed to recur. One was a kind of treatment of Cleo, right? That he sees her as not being given voice to, right? That she is depicted by another.
That's actually the title of the article. The article's called "There's a Voice Missing in Roma," I think.
That's right. Well, and to be brutally frank, I agree, right? And I actually think that all of the Mediatico pieces that I read are too quick to put that under the carpet. So I think there are some things that the film is really praiseworthy about. First of all, I don't remember very many films about indigenous people, being the protagonists of films to begin with.
No.
I certainly don't remember films in which indigenous people, are given the point of view for the whole film as protagonists. So, to me, the film really stands out. But on the other hand, I think the other thing about, this is a film kind of made by, someone from another class and another race, and with all of these structural kind of differences that show in the film. So, I think that there's no question that Cuarón is trying to be sympathetic and empathetic, but I also think it's very much kind of an upper-class privileged person's view of these people, and I don't think, actually, that the maid's wishes, her desires, her life are, expressed in a full, textured way, my mom and my aunts were all cleaners and nannies and so on, and let me tell you, they didn't live their life for the family. They had families of their own, and they had brothers and sisters and children, and the film touches on none of that, right? The film's way of making the maid a protagonist, right, is having her had a boyfriend on the side, obviously, her pregnancy, and the conversations with her friend who is also the maid in the house, right? You have a little conversation where New Year's Eve, where she talks to, one of the old people, takes her to a party. That's about it. And there's a reference to her mother, whom she can't help because she's embarrassed to be shown pregnant, right? that is not a fully rounded life. I mean, she probably had a father and brothers in the village and cousins, and I mean, there's a much richer life it's a kind of a conceit of the upper classes to think that their servants live only for them. And actually, that's pretty much what you see in this film. And I take great exception to that, and I agree with Richard Brody.
Yeah, well, so what Brody talks about is Cleo being constructed as a trope of the sort of noble, quiet, stoic labourer who kind of keeps themselves to themselves, and that makes them strong somehow. And that's a problem, that she should have more of a life, or there should be more of kind of who she is. You should be able to understand more of who she is, rather than in a more complex way, rather than just seeing her as a set of tropes. And I think one of the responses to that in the Mediatico article, I can't remember which one it was, I'm trying to find it, said there's another way of looking at that, which is that if she did have more of a voice, that would miss the point of how she's dehumanised in the world that she lives in. That actually seeing, I'm kind of putting words in the writer's mouth now, this isn't exactly what they said, but seeing the entire world being seen through the eyes of Cuarón and the people of whom he is a part, the upper middle class basically, kind of necessarily means that she doesn't have that much of a voice. And I'm not saying I entirely agree with that. Well, I think the issue with kind of having a voice or not, it's not about, I don't think it's about kind of power. It's about like the fact that she is so quiet and just kind of accepts things throughout the film and kind of knows her place, if you like, wouldn't be an inherent negative if it meant something to her character. If it meant something to the film, and I don't think it does.
Or if there were other things going on. I mean, frankly, people in that position don't have much choice but to be quiet and subservient, and so on. But actually, there's a difference between their actions in public and their inner feelings. And actually, I do think that what you don't get very much in this film is access to her inner feelings.
Right.
To her point of view on that subservience and what she has to keep inside and hidden. And so...
Yeah.
And I think,
or that if she is suppressing that about herself, then that's not dramatised either.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
And actually, I think the film is too sentimental about the upper class family. So I'm willing to believe that an upper class family is so kind and generous and so on, right? And there are, to be fair to the film, moments of sharpness towards the servant from, the mother and so on. But actually, I think it's all, the family is almost excessively good, and you could, from what we know historically about the conditions of domestic workers, that would be an exceptional instance. I mean, they're ripe for exploitation and sexual abuse and, and lack of payment and all kinds of things. So I think the film is overly sentimental about itself, about that family, and also about the maid herself. I mean, there's that moment where, they're in the martial arts thing and the guru is showing, a stance that only the very great masters can do. And nobody in the field, none of these people training to be warriors can do it. And the maid does it easily. Mm-hmm. And actually, I think, come on. That's silly. That's kind of imbuing her with kind of,
she's supernatural.
Yeah,
she's
superpowers.
Mary Poppins.
I mean, you can imbue or characterize people as having inner strength without kind of silly things like that, really.
Yeah. You mentioned the look of the film, the black and white.
Yes.
To say that you tend to find it pretentious, a modern film doing that.
Yes.
Did you say whether you think that about this though?
Well, to be honest, I can't understand why it's in black and white. I mean, there might be contextual reasons for it. There might be financial reasons. Maybe they didn't have the money to kind of bring together coherent a color scheme, say, or a design scheme for the film that would use color. I mean, all of those things kind of are expensive. But I can't think of a reason for shooting it in black and white that's not a negative.
There's a distancing effect to it, I think, and a kind of idealizing look. it's not realistic. It's there's a I don't want to say dreamlike because that's such a cliche, but I can't think of a better word either. You know what I mean? There's a kind of nostalgic, kind of imaginary quality to what's going on, which I think may go along with kind of what you're saying about the idealization of the way that life is depicted. It doesn't feel realistic. It feels idealized. I think it looks very beautiful. I think there are some amazing shots in there. I think there are some wonderful kind of composition. I think the things when you first see the car being pulled into the drive, and it's so wide it only just fits, and it's done where you don't see the dad driving it at all. You just see the car kind of just getting by on the walls. You see his hand moving on the gear stick.
That whole scene was fantastic. I cringed.
Intercut close-ups. So there are some wonderful kind of visual moments, and I think the black and white kind of high contrast look to it is worth it for its own sake. I think it's beautiful to look at, but
I'm less convinced of that. And actually, it was interesting again referring back to that Mediatico dossier, where he was saying, well, part of the pleasure of seeing it in 65 is to see the gradations of of contrast and in the black and whites and so on, that you actually see more and see better. So maybe that's part of a design that we didn't get seeing it on Netflix. I thought the shots were extraordinary. I actually didn't think that visually it was extraordinary. So let me make a distinction. So the composition of shots was extraordinary. The actual kind of filming of it, I didn't find it so.
The execution.
Yes. I mean, I didn't think... So, when I'm talking about shots, it's almost like I'm talking about, how space is kind of constructed through the camera and through camera movement. And some of those things, like I said, the students protest on one side while, kind of being in the furniture store, on the other side of the frame. I thought that, wow, that's kind of extraordinary. I mean, imagine kind of organizing that, right? Yeah. But when you're looking at the image itself, I kind of... I didn't. It didn't register very much with me. I mean, what I'm noticing is often questions like, "Why is there so much flare? Like, what's the purpose of the flare?" Yeah. Right? Or kind of there are scenes, for example, in the beach where I thought it could have all been done more poetic. Really, So I'm not fully convinced of that. I think what is extraordinary about the film is the sound.
Yes.
I kind of. We saw it in Sensurround, was it?
Surround sound.
Surround sound. Sorry.
Frankly, what a privilege it is for you to have been given a surround sound system by me free of charge,
because I know the difference so well.
because this film really takes advantage of it, and actually takes advantage. I mean, when you talked about the execution of the shots, I was thinking the phrase student film. In a not complimentary way, because what I mean is that there are shots which are so sort of deliberately and carefully composed, but seem to lack anything more than technique, that you just notice them, you notice the shots, and I don't think that's to the film's credit. And I think to an extent you could say the same of the sound design, insofar as you don't tend to get soundtracks in which the rear speakers are used so heavily in the sound mix. So in this, I think it's to the film's credit though in this, I think it works very well, that in this, the film kind of goes to pains to really, and again this is a bit of a cliche, but put you in the middle of a scene. And what I mean by that is you'll be situated in the kind of soundscape between two characters speaking. One in front of the camera, and the other behind, and the sound will come from behind when they speak. That's not very usual. Sound is normally, no matter where the character is coming from the front, So it's very noticeable, but I think it works. There are times when you're sat in... I remember a part in particular where you're sat kind of with the family and the TV's on, and the TV's in front of you and you hear the family behind, and then the camera cuts, looks the other way, and the family's in front and you hear them eating dinner and what have you, and the TV's behind. And you get this feeling of the life, of the world, and I think that kind of goes that goes hand in hand with those 360-degree shots, where you're kind of trying to be given a sense of a living world that's all around you. That somehow, by giving you this off-screen space, the film is intimating a much bigger world than what you're seeing on screen.
Yes.
Which I think is interesting. Again, I think it's very noticeable. I don't think it ever kind of blends into the background. And there are times when the sound design, I think, very deliberately gets incredibly loud in all the speakers, you know, and like at the beach, for instance, or the forest fire. You know, things get unbelievably loud, and you can hardly ignore it, you know. But there's something very bold about it, and entertaining. And again, I suppose I would say a bit like the black and white, kind of worth it for its own sake. I'm not sure if it's really achieving any more than that.
I missed the colour in this. I think it would have been lovely to have seen Mexico in the 1970s in colour.
Yeah.
You know, so I don't understand the black and white. But let's go back to the central thing, because I do think it's I love Cuarón's Y tu mamá también, which this has references to, actually. You know, there's a scene in Y tu mamá también where, you know, they're driving across the mountains, and one of the narrators says, and that's where my nanny was from, blah, 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 I'm not telling anybody, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
You know, there's kind of like a reference to that in Y tu mamá también. But I love Y tu mamá también. I love Children of Men. I loved Gravity, which I have not, you know, seen since I saw it on a big screen, but on a big screen, it was amazing.
I went back to see it when it was, they re-released it a couple of months ago, and it was still really good.
Yeah. So, you know, I think he is truly a great director, which I am not convinced that Iñárritu is, for example. So, you know, kind of, these criticisms of this film are, you know, within that context, yeah? I still think it's an extraordinary film. I still think kind of what it does, you know, to make the protagonist this indigenous servant is quite extraordinary. I think it has little touches that do void some of the arguments that I have with it. So, for example, you do get the sense that the maids live in a completely different world. And one of the ways that you do is orally through the soundtrack, right? So, you know, the film begins, I think it's Rocío Jurado who's singing, you know, so they have the radio on and they're listening to pop music and rancheras and, right? And, you know, then with the father's always listening to classical music, right? And so on. So you do get the sense that the servants live in different worlds and they have a different voice and so on. I still don't think that they're given as much interiority as I would like and as much context. I mean, you know, but you could argue maybe that their context is the family, this family that, you know, they might as well be indentured to, you know, and that actually maybe that's the complexity of the film. That, you know, there is love and affection, but also hierarchy and gradations and power. Yeah, the film does kind of dramatize all of that. And that actually is quite a complex thing to dramatize, you know, which I think is really great.
Yeah. I do think that not just the maids, but everyone in the film I connected to through what felt like signifiers rather than kind of really deeply built characters. I felt there were signifiers of what the characters represented, you know, or the kind of classes and backgrounds that they, you know, was kind of hinted at that they came from. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. I mean, the thing is that on the one hand you've got Richard Brody whose piece I was like, oh, he said everything and so much better, and on the other hand you've got the Mediatico articles, which I think are fantastic and just picked up on things or talked about things that I had barely thought of or given no consideration to at all. That just saw things I didn't. You know,
an example?
Oh, I can't think. All of them. I mean, no, really. There were a couple that talk about it being. That talk about the distribution and the kind of, one guy talks about seeing it in Mexico and someone else talks about its distribution on Netflix. So those not exactly, but the ones that speak about the way that kind of feminism is depicted, or the idea that kind of the mother can afford to be a kind of new feminist because she has a maid picking up the slack for her.
Absolutely.
It's an interesting kind of thing, which is something that I just don't,
Yes.
needed the article to sort of pick up on that sort of thing for me. So
yes. I mean, it's the film is very interesting, and I really recommend it to everybody. Because on the one hand, like, the patriarchal world is depicted like so beautifully, so clearly. The husband comes home and he's complaining about the house not being clean enough and, full of dog shit. And, as soon as she's divorced, this guy just comes on to try it with her because she's available. So the film brings up issues of sexism and patriarchy kind of very clearly. I think it doesn't bring up, distinctions between the rural and the urban, and the indigenous and the white population, or, classes and, a subaltern person. It's all there, but, well, I was going to say it doesn't do it to the extent that I'd like. I'd like more the maid's point of view, and the maid given more of a life and a richer inner life, and I think she is a bit of a cipher, really, kind of, and I do think that is the result of, a white upper middle class person from the background of the family depicted in the film making that film. I do think, a kind of somebody from an indigenous background or a poor background, or somebody whose family had been maids would have told a very different story about that.
And someone who wasn't a kid when this was all like this is the thing I say about when
That's a good point.
When
yes.
directors are making films about what their life was like when they were kids. Of course, everything was better back then. They were kids.
Yes, they didn't understand all the problems. They didn't see them. They were hidden from them.
Again, this was in the Brody article where he talks about something that Cuarón has said in another interview about how when he was a kid, the stories that his maid would tell him, his maid/nanny, would tell him about kind of where she came from and hardships and things like that, he thought of as adventures. Whereas to her, obviously, they weren't.
Yes.
But it's like, that's a kid's perspective, and it's like, and that kind of stays with you. He doesn't remember life being rubbish, and he doesn't depict life as being rubbish, and can't. Seems to have little conception of it. There is the riot, which is clearly a big deal, and people got shot in it, and ruthlessly, and like kids kind of being chased, students being chased and shot, but it's a kind of spike out of almost nowhere.
I don't know if it's out of nowhere.
Okay.
I mean, so, you hear in dialogue, about somebody just being shot on the street in front of the grandmother, I think. So, you have a sense that casual violence is part of the life. Also, the neighborhood that they live is an upper class one, and you could see, that they're protected by these barriers. I mean, kind of, this is a neighborhood under siege in a way. So, it has an inner door, it has an outer door. You see that the family has a driver that drives them, and I'm sure partly that's for security reasons. It's not just two drives, since they all can drive, right? So, it's kind of like a chauffeur bodyguard, right? Kind of, the film has intimations of all of those things, and there's that recurring thing of, the band or the soldiers maneuvering through the street.
Yes.
That recurs several times. I'm not sure what to make of it yet, but we see that 3 or 4 times, right?
Yeah.
So that would probably kind of require a different viewing. But I don't think it comes out of nowhere.
That's unfair, but
it's interesting because we're talking about the influence of neorealism, which the film, I think, is very evident in the film. And obviously another of the things that neorealism, was famous for was the melodrama. And that moment that we're talking about is an intensely melodramatic moment, right? She goes by the crib for her baby. The student protests happen around her. Somebody comes into the furniture store to shoot other people. And then one of the people who is actually doing the shooting is the father of her baby as her water breaks. Yeah. I mean, that's intensely melodramatic, right? Like, I mean, kind of, so, and of course, then the baby ends up being born dead, right? And, because she didn't want it, and so on. Well, she thinks because she didn't want it. So, I mean, I think the film is really, like you said earlier, it's very carefully put together. It's very carefully structured. Everything is there for a reason, you know. I think kind of some of the ways that it's knit through, I'm not sure I fully grasp yet. And I think it would benefit from a second viewing. I think Cuarón's films always do. But I think this question of perspective, you know, so everybody's talking about it's Cleo's point of view and Cleo has a voice. Well, actually, it's Cuarón's point of view on Cleo from a moment of his childhood. There's kind of various kinds of distancing kind of going on. And she doesn't get much of a voice. And actually, she doesn't get kind of much interiority. And I actually think that because... So the film is being praised for elements of the film that I think it falls short on. Where actually there are other aspects of the film that I think are magnificent, really.
Yeah. The world building or the kind of...
It's more like the dynamics of worlds,
right?
Yeah, that kind of are separate but interconnected, right? So, you know, for example, you know, when they go on holiday for Christmas or whatever, you know, and there's all these rich people and they're doing the guns and there's the forest fire and the decor and all the heads of their pets and yeah, I mean, kind of, you know, and then kind of the grandmother is there, but this guy comes on to the mother, right? And, you know, the maid goes into another netherworld, you know, where they go through huge steps to get to. Feels like, you know, going to a whole other world. Well, all that is taking place at the same time. And, you know, there's all these dynamics about race and class and gender, yeah, that kind of erupt in interesting ways, you know, in one scene, right?
Yeah,
you know,
that's probably the best scene of the film.
So I think that's all great, really. I think it's a film to see again. Yeah, and so, you know, I'm being contrarian, I suppose, because, you know,
how unlike you.
Well, you know, you're trying to grasp things. So basically, I would say that Brody is not wrong, you know, and actually the criticisms that he levels of the film are kind of criticisms worthy of consideration.
They have some foundation.
Yes.
But at the same time, what the writers for Mediatico wrote, quote, to some degree in response and to some degree just expressing what they thought, are also just as worthy of consideration.
Well, no, absolutely.
Kind of one or the other.
You know, and I think that's the film's richness. Yeah. So and
who knew that people could have different opinions on things and they both could be acceptable? That's not the way I was brought up.
Anyway, we should probably wrap up here. Really, yeah. I was really riveted, and as I said, I had prejudices about the black and white, and also about the length. And you know, I was enthralled throughout, and certainly it's given us a lot to talk about, and a lot more to think about. So I'd highly recommend it.
Yeah. I mean, all of that. I wasn't as riveted. So when we paused it at about 52 minutes, when you went to get a glass of water, personally, I would have happily just turned it off. And I think that is one of the problems with watching a film on Netflix. That in the cinema, I certainly wouldn't have left. You know. Well, if I'd been watching this on my own, I very likely wouldn't have stuck it out, which would have been to my detriment because it was worth finishing. I mean, you know, it'd be very churlish to say, and I wouldn't have missed anything. Like, clearly, it's worth finishing, but that's always going to be a detriment of the Netflix versus cinema thing.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
You know,
that's a
different conversation.
A different argument, but yeah.
But
worth a look, certainly.
Yes.
And certainly in the context of the various things people have written about it, because that's all enriched my experience of it.
Yes, and actually that's worth underlining, you know. So the film is a talking point culturally at the moment. And, you know, part of the reason is that there's so many interesting things that have been written on it. One is the Richard Brody article for The New Yorker, and the other is this Mediatico special issue, you know, that was done almost immediately. I was actually shocked to see how quickly they turned it around. So basically Dolores Tierney got 8 people, I think, you know, all really distinguished people, really distinguished writers on the field, to write immediately, kind of, the responses to the film, and having seen it kind of in different places, and they're all worth reading. So we would highly recommend this Mediatico special issue, and we will post the link to this podcast.
And they're all on a range of topics. That's the really great thing about the Mediatico issue.
Yes.
There are people who talk about the distribution. There are people who talk about. There's one guy who talks about having watched it in Mexico and what that was like. There are people talking about the themes and the design of the film and so on. So there's a lot to talk about, and the pieces are. We kind of got through them in sort of 15-20 minutes. They're not very long essays either.
No, they're not.
They're very concise.
Yes.
And well written.
So highly recommend, and really kind of worth having at least a skim through once you've seen the film. It will really enrich your experience of watching it.
Yeah, sound.
All right. Thank you very much for listening. We are Eavesdropping at the Movies, and
we're on iTunes and SoundCloud and YouTube, Facebook and Twitter, and eavesdroppingatthemovies.com is our website.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.